welcome to another not so late night. It's only like 10:40. We're gonna be talking, I don't know what week this is. I think it's week 21. We're gonna be talking about the 1950s and how did the 1950s deal with the lingering traumas of World War II. So, like I said, this is kind of not a trilogy, but we're gonna continue seeing how in the 20th century World War II affected a lot, and we're gonna continue looking at that trend. You may think of the 50s, and although you may think of it as a really socially conservative and restrictive era, people of the 50s saw group identity as a really important tool to bring them back into the normality that they really, really searched for. So they wanted this normality after the trauma of the Second World War, and Americans embraced a lot of social conformity and a group identity in various different forms. We're going to be looking at the three major forms of identity that people embraced in the 50s. First, we're going to look at the bourgeoisie life and suburbia, which we touched on last week, and social conformity, losing oneself in social compliance and consumerism. And then second, we're going to look at kind of the neo-bohemian culture and values that was kind of anti-consumerist but still consumerist in its own right. And then lastly, we're going to be looking at the Marxist ideas and Marxism as another identity. So first, let's talk about the post-war period, what it was like. Obviously, there was a lot of trauma that everyone's going through, and dealing with that. And when it gets to the 50s, this generation really just wants to put that all away, and they really want normality. They want life to feel normal, and there's a lot of security that comes with social compliance and conformity, and so they really, the 50s falls onto that as a group identity to take them out of this trauma and this uncertainty that the war had brought upon them. And then the bourgeois culture, not the bourgeois, the bohemian culture does the same thing in a different way, and so does the anti-consumerism and Marxist ideas. So all of these are ways to try to fill this void that was brought on by World War II, and there's three subcultures, right? So first we're going to look at bourgeois values. Also, side note, mortar and pestle, if your grinder breaks, just get yourself a mortar and pestle and grind your coffee. Works like a charm. It may be a little less ground than you like it, but you know what? You can handle little grounds. Also, not to plug, Five and Hope, but awesome. And I love their beads. We're looking at the Voyager roast tonight. Look at that. So anyway, back to the Viva. One of the biggest bourgeois values is social compliance and social uniformity. So we look at the 50s, and you can see even in their fashion this social compliance where all the men are in basically the same suits and the same colors and the tan and the black ties and their shirts, all the same. All the ladies kind of have the same dresses. There's a lot of social compliance, and for the bourgeois class, social conformity was looked on to be virtuous, which is really interesting. And this kind of impacts everything else that we're going to talk about and leads us to our next little sub-point. We're going to be talking about dating, which follows a very specific set of rules starting in the 1950s. And Astor Gross tells us about dating in the 1950s, and he says that in the 1950s, casual dating was still a fairly new concept. Before the war, young people typically only dated if they intended to marry in the future, and very rigid rules so that's end quote. So Astor Gross tells us basically that dating was really new, and he also goes on to tell us about the rigid rules that go along with the theme of social compliance in the bourgeois value set. And Astor tells us that, quote, dating also came along with a set of instructions just as would a new refrigerator or TV set. And these instructions were very, today in modern standards, very like male domineering and just very, let's just say I would never go on a date with a guy that did most of these, but that's just personal opinion. But basically the rules for dating were, firstly, a woman never asks the guy out. Second, you have to, as a girl, you have to say yes or no immediately. You have to give an answer. You can't say maybe. And then another rule is that you had to meet the parents of your date before you went on the date with them. You always had to hold the door of the car for the lady. These are all basically rules for men, and the women just have to shut up and sit there and look pretty, and that's all they have to do in the 50s dating rules. That's basically the summary of dating in the 50s. And there's also a lot of new terminology that comes along. Going steady term, pinning, when you basically define your relationship and make it official. And what else? Dear John, breaking up. That's means breaking up basically. The little black book is the book, telephone book. You put all the name of your dates in, or possible dates. So yeah, that's dating in the 50s. Part of the bourgeois class, like suburbia. Cars are also another huge part. Because of social conformity, everyone's pretty much the same, except for their cars. People kind of branch out with their cars. They want to be different, have their own unique identities, and the cars become a symbol of masculinity, but also personal identity and difference. And it's really interesting, along with cars, with the growing economy during this time, people are spending a lot more money, and conversely, they're also getting into a ton of debt. So in 1945, the debt in America was $5.7 million. In 1960, it rises to $56.1 billion in debt. That's insane. People are spending a lot more monies. Yeah. And then another part of the bourgeois value set, television. Another part of social compliance and conformity. Everyone was watching the same television. There wasn't a lot of channels. There was 3 channels. So chances are you're going to be watching the same programs every night as your neighbor, as your coworker, and then you have something that kind of ties you all together, puts you in a little box together. One of the shows from the 50s that everybody knows is I Love Lucy. Great show. Food was something that came about due to the innovations brought by World War II and the industrialization of everything in World War II, including food, and it brought us fast food chains like McDonald's and the highly processed food that we know and some of us love. don't know if I categorize myself as loving it, but I eat it sometimes. So the 1950s bourgeois culture, in a lot of ways, it used the technology from the war and used it to make modern life a lot simpler through a lot of innovations. And at the same time as it made it life efficient and simple, it also takes away really integral part of culture and kind of like detaches you from what you're doing, your tasks, and your culture by making everything easier. And so what we're going to be talking about next is a reaction to this detachment of culture and realness, and it's the Bohemian Society, which kind of really wants to rediscover essential America and what it was, its values, and kind of explore art and expression. We'll get to that. But first, I want to end with a quote from John Fawcett, and he says that as Americans, we love pragmatic, the bold and different, but we sometimes sacrifice our historical consciousness on the altar of innovation. And with that, we're going to move on to the Bohemian subculture, and I'm going to try to hurry up. So Bohemian values are kind of anti-consumerist, right? But at the same time as they're anti-consumers, they're kind of hippie and very like the OG hipsters. As I'm looking at myself, I'm kind of like embodying some. Never mind. We're gonna leave that alone because I like Bohemian. I like OG hipsters, but that's beside the point. And this is wasting time. So I'm sorry if you're watching this. You're listening to me. Yeah. Beat Generation was a literary movement, as is everything. Come on. That explored like I said in the previous point, explored kind of American culture and the influence of American culture. And it explored different religions, rejected traditional narrative values, which I want to pause right there, talk about rejecting of traditional narrative values in art specifically. And let's go detour to Jackson Pollock. I don't know why I'm here. So Jackson Pollock, everyone knows Jackson Pollock's splatter paintings. You've seen them, and this is a case for so many people to hate modern art because they simply don't see the point. But I'm here to tell you a little bit about my dear friend Jackson and tell you just about what his art meant and how it kind of fits into this bohemian culture, subculture. So, in his art, as I mentioned before I started talking about Pollock, his art takes away narrative. It's just splatters in his most famous work, right? He takes away the narrative completely, and he kind of wants to make it a lot like music. He numbers his paintings instead of titling them, just like musical compositions. And though he splatters his paint, a lot of people complain about this. They say it seems senseless. It seems like anybody could splatter paint on a canvas. Jackson is super purposeful with how he works and how he uses paint, and has a lot of control over his space, and is really purposeful about how he splatters, his technique, and there's a little more than goes on, more than splattering. And he actually said, I just love this, in a critique to the New York Times, in a critique of him by the New York Times, Pollock responded about his splatter paintings. I can't remember the name at the moment, but he said, "No chaos, damn it." And this just shows that he really did. He wanted people to see that it wasn't just this senseless splattering, as some people see it. So this movement that Pollock is a part of is referred to as abstract expressionism. And in abstract expressionism, artists would use abstraction to show and portray emotions, which really ties into World War II. People are trying to deal with everything that's going on in the world. What the heck is happening? And art is a perfect way, and abstract art abstract art specifically uses abstraction to show emotion that is really personal to each painter. And World War II really changed people and their inner turmoil and struggle. And about this, Pollock said that new needs need new techniques. Today, painters do not have to go to a subject matter outside of themselves. They work from a different source. They work from within. This goes along with the idea that there's this falling away of the narrative and focusing in on using emotion to make your art, kind of like, I don't know what else I was going to say. Lost that train of thought. But another interesting thing about Pollock, I could talk about him all day. I love him. He really wanted to show his viewers through his art. He wanted to tell them, like, don't look at the art and try to find purpose. Don't try to bring your preconceived notions into the art, but just enjoy it for what it is. And you may like it, you may not, and that's fine with me. And he described his art as, quote, energy and motion made visible. And so we can kind of see, and I kind of ranted a little bit, but I really want to show that everything Pollock did in a lot of ways was not as random as we think it is. There was a lot of purpose behind it, and it was purposeful, but it was also a little more free in its energy. And that's a lot like improv jazz, which is about something that I don't know as much about, and I'm not going to try to go there. But that was another part of the Bohemian value set. Basically, what you need to know for this point before I quickly move on is that it was a response against the bourgeois consumerism, but in the same way, kind of paralleled those consumerism values by really focusing on consumerism and identity and competition. And then lastly, we're going to talk about Marxist values. Come on. Didn't put enough water. I'm impatient at the same time as I'm patient. Also, it's only half calf, so I'm going to be fine. I'll probably get a few hours tonight. It's 11. Oh my gosh, it's 11. Marxist values. I don't know where I was. Marxist values, completely anti-consumerism, really focus on what we are going to call, what is called hard collectivism, and it kind of, Marxism is kind of like the communist values that won't call itself communism. It's from Marx, who kind of founded communism, but people during this era didn't really want to call themselves communism because of Stalin, and they were like, whoa, this guy's extreme. But it was based on self-denial, kind of like the Christian discipline, and yeah, it was a reaction against the bourgeois culture that we talked about in the first point. People saying, no, we need to be a selfless collective. And I have a poem that really sums this up. It's by Vladimir Mayakovsky, who says, who needs a one? The voice of a one is thinner than a squeak. Who will hear it? Only the wife. The one is nonsense. The one is zero. So the new Soviet man was a man that was selfless, and he was a selfless collective. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. Just one sec. Maybe I drank from the sink, but you'll never know, because that's not shown in the frame. So whatever. So back to Marxism. This selfless collective idea of a man summed up in this poem that there is no such thing as the one. The one is zero, which I love math-wise. But there was also people that really embraced this Stalin's communism, even after they found out about all the atrocities that Stalin had done. And we're gonna talk a little bit about the Cambridge Five, who were a spy group, and they were all members of the ruling class, all really influential in British government and Secret Service ops. And it was a group of 5 men. We have Philby, Burgess, Blunt, McLean, and I didn't write this out well, Carncroft. And they were all spies for the Soviets, recruited while they were students at Cambridge, and they gained influence during the Second World War, in which they kind of climbed the ropes of government. They already kind of had it made for them as part of the ruling class, and they all kind of, they spied during the Cold War, pretty dope, and none of them actually got charged. Like, none of them stood trial for the crimes they did, and like the intelligence they did for the Russians. It's really interesting how they were just living double lives. Eventually, everyone finds out about this, and they kind of get caught, because you can't live a double life forever. But yeah, they were the people that kind of rejected, that held on to communism, even with Stalin, and kind of were edgy. I don't like that word, but whatever, I'm gonna use it. And Philby says, one of the members of this group, he says that it cannot be so very surprising that I adopted a communist viewpoint in the 1930s. So many of my contemporaries made the same choice. And Philby says about his decision that he doesn't regret it, and he kind of looks at it as everyone else kind of fell away from this communist idea, but I stayed the course, which I think it's very interesting. We viewed it as this way. But anyway, we can see these 3 subcultures. We can see the people trying to respond to the traumas of World War I by kind of taking up these identities and finding their safety and solace in these identities. And the 3 identities are the bourgeois values, suburban values, the bohemian anti-consumerism, bohemian, the identity, neo-bohemian identity, and then thirdly, the Marxist identity. So, I'm sorry this went long. I really tried. The later it gets, the more I talk, and that's just dangerous. But I'm gonna go drink some coffee, do some homework, and just have a good night, guys. Don't die. Be safe. Love you. Um,